Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're talking about what should probably end up being the last film in the X-Men franchise, Logan. First, let's talk a little bit about Westerns. Because believe it or not, the Western genre and the superhero genre, they've got a lot in common. You have these idealized, borderline mythic heroes, a lot of violence, a lot of stylized facing on the frontier. You have a lot of ambiguous heroes and villains, and there's always that fight against civilization, against something that might be greater or worse, bringing out the best and worst of humanity. There's a lot of common parallels between a lot of mainstream and even off-brand mainstream, or even spaghetti westerns, and a lot of what you're seeing in the superhero genre. Let me say this, there was a point when the westerns, or at least the people behind the westerns, knew they had to end. They had gone through nearly every permutation of it. They had seen the idealized Western get twisted and contorted into so many ways that it just started becoming formulaic. And they needed a way to put a final stake in the ground and cut it off at the roots. And in 1992, Clint Eastwood did that in a movie that he starred and directed in called Unforgiven. It's a movie that won a crap ton of Academy Awards for damn good reason, but a lot of people said that this was, and it should be, the final Western. It was the movie that effectively killed the genre for several years until they decided to bring it back. And I think a lot of people, going into Logan specifically, I'm a little surprised there haven't been more comparisons to Unforgiven, given a lot of some thematic parallels, and given so much of what this movie should thoroughly do to any future X-Men movie. If any movie producer worth his salt sees this and then walks away saying, we should have more X-Men movies, or we should try to do more of this, fire them, and then beat them with a shillelagh because they are wrong. Now, to explain all this, we need to talk a little bit about Logan itself as a film, and let's get this out of the way. Yes, it's a great movie. Of course you're gonna like it. Of course you're gonna see it. A lot of guys who have been watching and growing up with the X-Men, they're going to shed many a manly tear, and I don't blame them whatsoever. But that's the key thing. This is coming from somebody who is not a huge X-Men fan. I mean, I read the comics, I saw the TV show, I played a little bit of the video games, and I've seen all of the movies, but I would not categorize myself as a hardcore, diehard X-Men fan. When you take a look at the movies, on average, the best of them is First Class, maybe Deadpool, maybe X2. It is not held up as well as you think it has. And going back to that, there's not a lot of real quality going forward in the film franchise that I was all that engrossed in. And yeah, a lot of the main part of it is because Wolverine himself. I'll admit I'm not a huge fan of the character. Yes, I kind of admire that he's Canadian. I admire that there's a lot to him in terms of his backstory and how he integrates with the rest of the X-Men that I kind of find a little fascinating. And I'm a little amazed that he as a character, especially with Hugh Jackman playing him, has had the level of longevity and love that he has. He's not Patrick Stewart playing Charles Xavier. When you take a look at so much of the movies, they've been based upon that character. They've been based upon, well, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. That has been the anchor point of X-Men for so long. And really, this movie plays on that a lot. To the point where, yes, it's slowly killing him thanks to adamantium poisoning in the near future. Charles Xavier is almost off even worse with some sort of neurological condition that's causing him to have these psychic fits that makes him a danger to the rest of society. The symbolism is deconstructionist, kind of on the nose, and there's a fair bit of on-the-nose symbolism in this movie. We will get to it. I'll try not to spoil much. But at some level, these people are in a universe that doesn't really need mutants anymore. Whatever is left, they've been killed, and often in a way that is really genuinely horrifying when you think of it, and the repercussions it has on one character in particular. And yet, there are still some people who want to create mutants. So Logan, who's slowly dying, he gets approached by a woman who asks her to escort a certain little child who is showing off some mutant powers to a secret place somewhere up in North Dakota so they can slip over the border into Canada and find some level of freedom and salvation. Again, keep in mind this little girl is from Mexico and crossing over to Canada, across the barren, often pretty damn bleak hellscape that's come across of most of the United States. All the more intimidating because of how familiar and how likely a future like this could be, which I find kind of a little bit amazing. It's at the point very much analogous to Mad Max, where society hasn't quite collapsed, but it's definitely on the precipice there, which makes it all the more chill and haunting, especially in the second act. But yeah, political commentary is a little on the nose there, but let's get to the actual story itself. As I said, this is a great movie. But it's a great movie because it is almost entirely stripping out many of the elements that have made the X-Men such a frustrating film franchise. Indeed, most of this film tends to ignore almost all the continuity hiccups that tend to happen throughout the majority of X-Men, with the exception of Hugh Jackman as Logan, Patrick Stewart as Charles Xavier. They're the anchors for this audience, which means it can get a little bit awkward when you consider this film as an R rating and then takes advantage of that R rating. You'll never be able to get away from the moment when Charles Xavier says fuck the first time, but at the same time, it's also a film that plays upon a lot of that assumed empathy that we have for those characters and stretches it into something that really does feel like a punishingly bleak film. The big comparison to Unforgiven is that it has that feeling of coming to an end, and it has a lot of those slower meditative moments and knowing that this final climax is coming in some way, shape, and form. Now, a lot of this does tie into the fact that there is hope that's being represented by that little girl, which, you guessed it, she's X-23, and she's showing off some of her mutant powers and abilities. Even though this is technically an inspiration and drawn upon from Old Man Logan, it's a very, very loose adaptation at that, but it's very much of she and any other mutants that might still exist. They represent the last remaining hopes, and they all end up in Canada. But the fun thing that ties into all this, and I will say this for Daphne Keane, she is a spectacular actress, but this is where things get a little bit interesting, because when it comes to a superhero movie, a lot of the big selling point comes in a lot of the action, comes in the blockbuster. And while this is indeed a very hard R when it comes to a lot of the violence, it's also very telling that this is not violence that is glorified. You're not getting the sort of glory kills. A lot of the kills are quick, they're extremely bloody. It's a graphic movie, but it's not lingering on it. It's not looking like to be the glorious rollout that was Rambo. This indeed is playing a lot closer to a movie like Unforgiven, a movie that has that bloody element, but that's more because it's the reality that these characters are now forced to live in. And I say forced because, yeah, this is a punishingly small scale and bleak sort of film. The main characters, the ones that we've held on to for so long, the ones that so much of a certain generation has branded as a father figure, as characters they are to look up to despite their myriad flaws, well, now they're dying, and they're dying in slow, debilitating, painful fashion. It's seeing dreams that are held up in comic books, and yeah, there are comic books in this movie that are tying back to, yeah, there are people who are telling stories, writing myths surrounding Logan, even though he'll wholeheartedly admit that a lot of it's fantasy, but now these myths are crashing down when they're confronted with actual reality. It's kind of analogous to one of the main themes that underlies a lot of The Wire, in that people aren't exactly good or bad, and a lot of expectations will be held short. There isn't some grand conspiracy. It's just that systems are failing, people are failing, and people are only human. And this ties back to, well, a lot of the reason why this movie has so much gut punch of an impact beyond just the ending. A lot of the acting here is top of the line. If this movie was potentially released for Oscar contention, Hugh Jackman should be getting nominated for Best Actor, because the paces that he puts his character forward makes me enough to care about Wolverine, even despite a whole slew of movies where I was wholeheartedly sick of Wolverine. That is saying a lot. And yeah, Patrick Stewart as Charles Xavier, he's always owned that part, and the paces that he puts his character through, especially given what he is repressing in some of his past, that's haunting, and that's a hard set of scenes to actually get through, especially considering that there is still fragments of that character that has survived despite any sort of mental illness that he's still suffering under. And yeah, I must say this, Daphne Keane as X-23, she is one of the most compelling kid screen presence I have ever seen, in terms of the violence that she gets involved in terms of the language and how well she fits within that reality, and how blunt and effective her character is, recognizing that this is the new future, this is our generation. And there's some great little visual callbacks to show just how annoyed that Logan is, with the representation of our generation looking quite like that, it really is something to behold, and she puts her character through a lot of great work. Now, I will say this movie is flawed, and it mostly comes in our villains. For one, I wasn't entirely behind our main villain. He seemed a little bit like a toady midway through, and that's because that he does get swapped out for Richard E. Grant, who's going to be playing a little bit more of our mainstay scientist villain that you would otherwise expect coming out of the comics. The problem comes in the build-up and pacing of these characters. You'd like to think that they'd be able to be introduced a little bit more effectively. A lot of it's almost off-screen, if anything. You never got the feeling that they are entirely as intimidating or provide the level of distinctive threat, especially until they unleash a certain character, which is Wolverine's match, if not more. I get why they did it. I get the symbolism of introducing that particular character to contrast against Wolverine's own persistent inner demons, but I'm not entirely a fan of it. I think that it ultimately strikes me as it doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the very lo-fi, very rugged, very bleak tone of the rest of it. It's an element that feels introduced and only to heighten up the tension when it didn't need to do that. Hugh Jackman is putting forward a tremendous amount of acting work here regardless. They didn't need to bring in this additional added threat to make it sell that, yeah, he's dying, he's suffering, he's not able to do what he was able to do. You just needed maybe the lesser bad guys to come after him. You're now having a guy who's being brought down by men that he could normally tear apart, but just not in any way close to the same way. So yeah, the villains, they're a bit of an issue, but let's be honest, the villains have consistently been an issue in X-Men movies. They're not being played by Sir Ian McKellen. But going beyond that, I ultimately think this is a real heart-wrenching film, especially when it comes down near the end. But then again, it doesn't surprise me why this is coming out, especially when it comes to our generation. Let's get real here. If you take a look at consistent narratives that have cropped up in, say, the first season of The Walking Dead, or, I don't know, The Last of Us, or you can take a look to Logan itself, there's a lot of parenthood and specifically fatherhood metaphors that are passed along there, and like any fatherhood story, especially a long-running fatherhood story, it's really about cutting that loose. It's really about putting a definitive stake to the ground and ending and leaving something for that next generation to go off of. And they might be a little bit lost, they might not have learned all the lessons they need to, but at some point, it's all what they have. And that's what ties back to another film, and that's Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler. That also has some similar themes that come back into it and really has the similar sort of ending and emotional weight, and that most guys who see this are going to end up in tears, and again, I don't blame them for that. But it's very interesting to note this sort of fatherhood overall symbolism. It's something that's been consistent, especially when you consider superheroes. Like, keep in mind that the old comic books were given to kids who were, well, their fathers were away during the war. I think along the American Cowboy, how long that has resonated for so many people. It's where they end this film with a song from Johnny Cash, and I'm like, wow, this is thuddingly obvious symbolism, but it works. Because really, Logan is that last American cowboy, and really that last sort of X-Men superhero. And that's why I don't think they should ever make any more X-Men movies after this, and at least not for another 10 to 15, maybe 20 years. Because let's face it, you're not going to be able to replicate that Wolverine character. And one thing I love about the film is how they've shown how that character has cascaded outward. That legacy has been built, and that legacy has been maintained by so many people. To compound that, to run roughshod over that, I'm not sure you could really get it without Hugh Jackman playing Wolverine for as long as he has. You can bet that DC is going to try to recreate something similar with Batman in any upcoming Justice League movie or a Batman movie, and I'm sorry, it will not have the same weight unless you have that level of continuity. And yeah, that's only a level of continuity that would have been built because of the way comic books have shaped the film industry and brought in that level of continuity. I'm not sure you could do it otherwise, but at the same time, it's also something that has to be earned. And I don't think a lot of superhero films, especially X-Men movies, it's always kind of ironic that the X-Men movies, never being that good, were able to contribute to such a long-running legacy. And I absolutely think that it's the perfect way to end it, but I don't want to see it recreated, because you need to earn that. And unfortunately, what we're likely going to see a lot more is the blood and the violence, but even then, this movie does not glorify that blood and violence. It's not Rambo. It's very much a movie that shows that it's a part of that world, that near encroaching future world that seems all the more relevant here and now, where a lot of our heroes are dying and have failed us, and we have to now step up to take in that role to otherwise fight against rapacious, authoritarian institutions. Yeah, there is some political commentary on that. It's subtle, it's well played, but man, I really liked it. But really, I can say that as a whole. This is a subtle movie. I think it could have been afforded to be a little better paced, especially in the third act. I think that it could have afforded to be a little bit longer, a little bit more meditative. I would have appreciated that. But at the same time, it does pretty much everything it's expected to do. I think it sticks the landing, and for me, 8 out of 10. Definitely recommend it. It's a great film. Definitely get a chance to go see this. I will say, if you're taking any person who's been a long-running fan of the X-Men, specifically the sort of fan who grew up with the movies, this one is going to hit them like a sack of bricks. And again, it's probably going to hit them in a lot of ways that people who grew up with cowboy movies saw Unforgiven. But as it is, I think this is a great film. I think it's easily probably the best X-Men film. I'd put it on par with First Class, if not better. It may be a deconstructionist take of a lot of these superheroes, but at the same time, it shows a lot why they matter. It shows a lot why they resonate. And it shows that even in their passing, they can inspire something great. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.
We'll stand up at the terror in each sip and in